John Barron.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know my right honourable friend will agree. That George war is preferable to war. But does he accept that, given Russian ambitions regarding Ukraine and events elsewhere, including the South China Sea, that the time has come finally for the UK to accept that we need to substantially increase our defence spending on a sustainable long-term basis, because George war is far more effective if you've got a strong armed forces?
The Prime Minister supported and delivered the biggest increase in defence spending since the Cold War. The £24 billion extra was to modernise our armed forces, as well as to make sure we were able to enter new domains where we are threatened by both Russia and other adversaries. That is the right track. We've always been consistent, as has the Prime Minister, which is fundamentally, if the threat changes, we should always be open to review. I think that's important. We should also recognise that we achieve our strength in the West through our alliances on our values and alliances on our defence spending. NATO is the best alliance for that. It is the keystone of European security. Our spending outstrips Russia, and our forces do as well. The only thing that we must make sure we continue is resolve. Resolve is what this crisis is about. We're resolved, the Prime Minister is resolved, the United Kingdom is resolved. We're going to stand up for our values against Putin's aggression.
Dave Dugan.
Deputy Speaker, from a logistical perspective, what efforts are being made to ramp up the provision of the Ukrainian military's specific requests for additional equipment and parts from the Ministry of Defence? How is this resource being coordinated with international partners to secure all the required resources and kit needed for the Ukrainians to defend themselves, and how are they being trained in its use?
I'm in constant contact with my defence counterpart in Ukraine. We talk regularly. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary has been incredibly supportive. We're currently at the stage where we have supplied, as I talked about, the anti-tank weapons and other non-lethal equipment. Britain has been side by side with Ukraine since 2014-15, so there's been significant amounts of training and capacity building, and we will continue to look at what other options are available. We have those discussions. Where we can, we meet their demand. Where not, we try and help other people meet it.
Robert Jenrick.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for the leadership that he's shown in recent months? And the paradox is that the more that Putin tries to draw countries towards Moscow, the more he repels them. And the more he revitalises the very alliance that he says he's most afraid of, NATO. But can I ask him specifically on sanctions? Will the UK, when it brings forward its package, ensure that they are synced with those from the United States, include action to prevent UK banks from handling foreign currency transfers from Russian state-owned banks, and include, as I know colleagues in the United States Senate would like to, specific sanctions against Nord Stream 2?
The President of the United States was very clear that he will stop Nord Stream 2. I listened to that press conference like everybody. Also, on the raft of sanctions the government has brought forward, they are intelligently targeted. They build on already existing sanctions after Crimea, but of course we'll continue to keep those measures under review.
Williams.
Speaker, Mr Putin is actually holding an unscheduled meeting with the Russian Security Council today, which he says in fact will decide on the recognition of the two breakaway republics. What would be the implication for the Minsk protocols of such an eventuality?
Well, I think, as I said to the honourable gentleman from Islington, we do urge both parties to have regard to the Minsk agreement. The Russians only a few weeks ago were saying it should be under the Minsk agreement. I think some of those measures go exactly against the Minsk agreement, and perhaps that is a clue to maybe what the real intention is.
Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, when last month I was in Donetsk Oblast with some members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, there was some sniper fire across the line of contact from Russian supporting forces. But what assessment has my right honourable friend made of recent false flag operations in recent days and indeed recent hours?
Shouldn't forget, the Ukrainians have had 10,000 people killed since the invasion of the Donbass. 10,000 people, often weekly or every month, on that line of control, young men and women who are simply guarding their border. The false flag operations have been growing. I think there is a worrying trend that what we've seen recently fits the bill or the playbook of what we can expect as the Russian government potentially seeks to destabilise and confuse the picture. We're not confused. We know what 160,000 troops mean, and so does the international community.
Rachel Maskell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, maintaining a diplomatic focus is absolutely crucial at this time, but could the government say what diplomatic focus they're bringing to Russian allies across the world? I haven't heard the Defence Secretary talk about that.
Well, the marked difference between Russia is they don't have any allies. Belarus is their only ally. By your friends you shall be judged. Belarus is it. That's one of the problems for Russia. It fails to recognise that international alliances are a sign of both civilised society and human rights. If you want to be on your own and stuff everyone else, you end up like North Korea. We would try and use our allies. We are certainly trying people who have more influence than others, but fundamentally it's going to be in the mind of President Putin what he does next.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To what extent does my right honourable friend believe the undignified withdrawal from Afghanistan by ourselves and our allies has emboldened President Putin and contributed to setting in train events that are now unfolding on the Ukraine border?
President Putin wrote his article last July before the Afghanistan withdrawal, so I think that is the biggest symbol of what his ambitions were. But it is absolutely the case that people who don't agree with our values sniff lack of resolve and take action. That's why we have to be resolved.
Margaret Ferrier.
Madam Deputy Speaker, what assessment has the government made of the threat against vulnerable minorities in the Ukraine, such as religious or ethnic minorities or members of the LGBTQ+ community? What discussions has the government had with international allies about preventing widespread human rights abuses in the event of an invasion?
In an event of an invasion, it doesn't matter whether you're a minority or a majority. The Russian government's attitude to those people that disagree with them, either at home or in another country, is woeful and dangerous.
Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, with the Russian military action in Transnistria, does the Secretary of State agree that Moldova is also at risk from the Russians, and has there been discussions with their government?
Countries are at risk, often embolden President Putin, which is why one of the reasons we are where we are today is post-2014-2015. Maybe the West was not tough enough on that initial invasion. Moldova, many other countries, smaller countries in NATO, Bosnia-Herzegovina are all causes for concern, and we must therefore recognise that now is not the moment to take the eye off the ball of places far away of which we sometimes know nothing.
Jim Shannon.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for his answers to the questions? With the latest news regarding Russian Security Council meetings that invasion is imminent, will the Secretary of State underline what human aid support is available for the ordinary, decent people of Ukraine? What has been done to provide medical supplies for the civilian casualties, which will undoubtedly be high when civilian militias are giving young and old with no weapons training arms to try and save their country?
First of all, I think we should have real admiration for the bravery of many of those people. And if you saw the President of Ukraine's speech at Ukraine, almost a desperate attempt to rally people to be more supportive. A number of countries, including Germany, for example, have supported with field hospitals and medical assistance. That is as important as lethal aid. We will do what we can, and I know many other nations are.
Raymond Shishti.
The stance and leadership the Secretary of State has taken with regards to preserving our international rules-based system. With regards to a specific issue where there is a loophole where Russia gets its money from, under the IMF's SDR, special drawing rights, $650 billion last year were allocated to states around the world, and Russia got $17.5 billion. I and my US counterpart, Congressman Hill from Little Rock, wrote to our respective governments asking them to put conditions to IMF SDR allocations. Will the Secretary of State now relook at that issue so that we can look at all loopholes along with firm sanctions?
My honourable friend, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, is here and will have heard that question. I will be delighted to refer it to the Treasury.
Mr. Speaker, Russia's already clearly mounting an absolutely massive disinformation campaign, especially through social media. Does my right honourable friend agree that it's vital that we and our allies communicate very clearly to Russians, Ukrainians and our own domestic audience that our and NATO's actions are very simple? They're about Ukraine's right to self-determination and sovereignty and essential to maintaining peace in Europe.
It's absolutely about the right to choose. And don't just take it from me, take it from the President of Finland, who made an outstanding speech in New Year's Day about that right.
Jameson. Mr. Speaker, thank you. History's proven that conflict between near-peer or peer adversaries gets very ugly. While I accept that NATO's potential for direct intervention is limited due to Article 5, what planning has been conducted for a possible cross-border refugee and humanitarian catastrophe?
It's incredibly important that NATO seeks to use the extra troops to provide both resilience, reassurance and containment. One of the reasons we have up to 400 Royal Marines in Poland is to assist Poland should a catastrophe happen and huge amounts of refugees pour across the border. I would urge the European Commission to make deep plans about what it's going to do with potentially massive migrant flows in a light of scale we have not seen since the Second World War.
Before we come to the statement on COVID, I would like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings is available to watch on Parliament Live TV. We now come to the statement. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I'll make a statement on our strategy for living with COVID. And before I begin, I know the whole House will join me in sending our best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen for a full and swift recovery. It is a reminder that this virus has not gone away. But because of the efforts we've made as a country over the past 2 years, we can now deal with it in a very different way, moving from government restrictions to personal responsibility. So we protect ourselves without losing our liberties and maintaining our contingent capabilities so we can respond rapidly to any new variant. Mr. Speaker, the UK was the first country in the world to administer an approved vaccine and the first European nation to protect half our population with at least one dose. And having made that decision to refocus our NHS this winter on the campaign to get boosted now, we were the first major European nation to boost half our population too. And it's because of the extraordinary success of this vaccination programme that we've been able to lift our restrictions earlier than other comparable countries, opening up last summer while others remained closed and keeping things open this winter while others shut down again, making us one of the most open economies and societies in Europe, with the fastest growth anywhere in the G7 last year. And while the pandemic is not over, we have now passed the peak of the Omicron wave, with cases falling, hospitalisations in England now fewer than 10,000 and still falling, and the link between infection and severe disease substantially weakened. Over 71% of all adults are now boosted in England, including 93% of those aged 70 and over. And together with the treatments and scientific understanding of the virus that we've built up, we now have sufficient levels of immunity to complete the transition from protecting people with government interventions to relying on vaccines and treatments as our first line of defence. As we have throughout the past 2 years, we will continue to work closely with the devolved administrations as they decide how to take forward their own plans. And today's strategy shows how we will structure our approach in England around 4 principles. First, we will remove all remaining domestic restrictions in law. From this Thursday, 24th of February, we will end the legal requirement to self-isolate following a positive test. And so we will also end self-isolation support payments, although COVID provisions for statutory sick pay can still be claimed for a further month. We will end routine contact tracing and no longer ask fully vaccinated close contacts and those under 18 to test daily for 7 days. and we will remove the legal requirement for close contacts who are not fully vaccinated to self-isolate. Until the 1st of April, we will still advise people who test positive to stay at home, but after that, we will encourage people with COVID-19 symptoms to exercise personal responsibility, just as we encourage people who may have flu to be considerate to others. Mr. Speaker, it's only because levels of immunity are so high and deaths are now, if anything, below where you would normally expect for this time of year, that we can lift these restrictions. And it's only because we know Omicron is less severe that testing for Omicron, on the colossal scale we've been doing, is much less important and much less valuable in preventing serious illness. We should be proud that the UK has established the biggest testing programme per person of any large country in the world. This came at vast cost. The test, trace and isolation budget in 2020-2021 exceeded the entire budget of the Home Office. It cost a further £15.7 billion in this financial year and £2 billion in January alone at the height of the Omicron wave. We must now scale this back. From today, we're removing the guidance for staff and students in most education and childcare settings to undertake twice-weekly asymptomatic testing. And from the 1st of April, when winter is over and the virus will spread less easily, we will end free symptomatic and asymptomatic testing for the general public. We will continue to provide free symptomatic tests to the oldest age groups and those most vulnerable to COVID. And in line with the practice in many other countries, we're working with retailers to ensure that everyone who wants to can buy a test. From April the 1st, we will also no longer recommend the use of voluntary COVID status certification, although the NHS app will continue to allow people to indicate their vaccination status for international travel. Mr. Speaker, the government will also expire all temporary provisions of the Coronavirus Act. Of the original 40, 20 have already expired and 16 will expire on the 24th of March. And the last 4, relating to innovations in public service, will expire 6 months later after we have made those improvements permanent via other means. Second, we will continue to protect the most vulnerable with targeted vaccines and treatments. The UK government has procured enough doses of vaccine to anticipate a wide range of possible JCVI recommendations. And today we're taking further action to guard against a possible resurgence of the virus, accepting JCVI advice for a new spring booster offered to those aged 75 and older, to older care home residents and those over 12 who are immunosuppressed. The UK is also leading the way on antivirals and therapeutics, with our antivirals task force securing a supply of almost 5 million, more per head than any other country in Europe. Third, SAGE advised there is considerable uncertainty about the future path of the pandemic, and there may, of course, be significant resurgences. They are certain there will be new variants, and it is very possible they will be worse than Omicron. So we will maintain our resilience to manage and respond to these risks, including our world-leading ONS survey, which will allow us to continue tracking the virus in granular detail, with regional and age breakdowns helping us to spot surges as and where they happen, and our laboratory networks will help us understand the evolution of the virus and identify any changes in characteristics. We will prepare and maintain our capabilities to ramp up testing. We will continue to support other countries in developing their own surveillance capabilities, because a new variant can emerge anywhere. And we will meet our commitment to donate 100 million vaccine doses by June as part of our agreement at the UK's G7 summit to provide 1 billion doses to vaccinate the world over the next year. In all circumstances, our aim will be to manage and respond to future risks through more routine public health interventions, with pharmaceutical interventions as the first line of defence. Fourth, we will build on the innovation that has defined the best of our response to the pandemic. The Vaccines Task Force will continue to ensure that the UK has access to effective vaccines as they become available, already securing contracts with manufacturers trialling bivalent vaccines which would provide protection against COVID variants. The Therapeutics Task Force will continue to support 7 national priority clinical trial platforms focused on prevention, novel treatments and treatments for long COVID. We are refreshing our biosecurity strategy to protect the UK against natural zoonosis and accidental laboratory leaks, as well as the potential for biological threats emanating from state and non-state actors. And building on the 5-point plan I set out at the UN and the agreements reached at the UK's G7 last year, we are working with our international partners on future pandemic preparedness, including through a new pandemic treaty, an effective early warning system or global pandemic radar, and a mission to make safe and effective diagnostics, therapeutics and vaccines available within the first 100 days of a future pandemic threat being identified. And we will be hosting a global pandemic preparedness summit next month. Mr. Speaker, COVID will not suddenly disappear. So those who would wait for a total end to this war before lifting the remaining regulations would be restricting the liberties of the British people for a long time to come. This government does not believe that that is right or necessary. Restrictions pose a heavy toll on our economy, our society, our mental well-being and on the life chances of our children. And we do not need to pay that cost any longer. We have a population that is protected by the biggest vaccination programme in our history. We have the antivirals, the treatments, and the scientific understanding of this virus. And we have the capabilities to respond rapidly to any resurgence or new variant. And, Mr. Speaker, it is time that we got our confidence back. We don't need laws to compel people to be considerate to others. We can rely on that sense of responsibility towards one another, providing practical advice in the knowledge that people will follow it to avoid infecting loved ones and others. So let us learn to live with this virus and continue protecting ourselves and others without restricting our freedoms. And in that spirit, Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Can I just... Mr. Sherman, please. Can I just say, I understand the statement was important and the Prime Minister did run over, so I'm more than happy for the opposition leaders to also run over. Keir Starmer.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by sending my condolences to the family of Christopher Stalford? Christopher was a dedicated servant of the people of South Belfast, and his loss will be deeply felt. I'd also like to send our best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen, and as the Prime Minister said, the whole House wishes her a speedy recovery. Yeah. Can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement and for the briefing earlier this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, huge efforts have been made over the last 2 years, and we would not be where we are today without the heroism of our NHS and key workers, those who pioneered and rolled out the vaccines, and the sacrifices that people made every day to follow the rules and protect our public health. We must honour the collective sacrifices of the British people and do everything possible to prevent a return to the loss and lockdowns we've seen over the last 2 years. The Prime Minister promised to present a plan for living with COVID. But all we've got today is yet more chaos and disarray. Not enough to prepare us for the new variants which may yet develop. an approach which seems to think that living with COVID means simply ignoring it. This morning, he couldn't even persuade his own health secretary to agree the plan. So what confidence can the public have that this is the right approach? Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. The Labour Party does not want to see restrictions in place for a moment longer than necessary. But, Mr. Speaker, we have to take the public with us, and that requires clarity.
Order. If you can't show the respect that I expect the Prime Minister to be heard inside, I expect the Leader of the Opposition. If you don't wish to be in here, there's plenty of room outside this chamber. I suggest you start using it, and I'll be helping you on your way. So let's have silence. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we have to take the public with us, and that requires clarity about why decisions are being made. So will the Prime Minister publish the scientific evidence behind his decision to remove the legal requirement to self-isolate, including the impact on the clinically extremely vulnerable, for whom lockdown has never ended? Having come this far, I know the British people will continue to act responsibly, and they will do the right thing, testing and then isolating if positive. What I can't understand is why the Prime Minister is taking away the tools that will help them to do that. Free tests can't continue forever, but if you're 2-1 up with 10 minutes to go, you don't sub off one of your best defenders. The Prime Minister is also removing self-isolation support payments that allow many people to isolate and weakening sick pay. These are decisions which will hit the lowest paid and the most insecure workers the hardest, including care workers who got us through the toughest parts of the pandemic. It's all very well advising workers to self-isolate, but that won't work unless all workers have the security of knowing that they can afford to do so. The Prime Minister mentioned surveillance and the ONS infection survey. This is crucial to ensuring that we can ramp up testing and vaccination if the virus returns. So can the Prime Minister confirm that he has put the funding in place to ensure that the ONS infection survey will not see reduced capacity and that it will be able to track the virus with the same degree of detail as it can today? We can't turn off Britain's radar before the war is won. Ignorance is bliss is not a responsible approach to a deadly virus. It actually risks undoing all the hard-won progress the British people have achieved over the last 2 years. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party has published a comprehensive plan for living well with COVID. Our plan would see us learn the lessons of the past 2 years and prepared for new variants. His approach will leave us vulnerable. Where's the plan to secure the UK's supply of testing? Why are schools still not properly ventilated? As a nation, there is no doubt we need to move on from COVID. People need to know their liberties are returning and returning for good. But this is a half-baked announcement from a government paralysed by chaos and incompetence. It is not a plan to live well with COVID. Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I really thought this was going to be the moment when he would end his run of making the wrong call on every single one of the big decisions. But, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, he's had the chance to back the government on the big decisions, and I'm afraid that he's got it wrong. And just to turn to some of the points that he's made, the evidence for what we're doing today is amply there in the scientific evidence, in the figures for the rates of infections that I've outlined today, and in all the data that is freely available to members of the House. And they can see what's happening with infection rates, with mortality, with what Omicron is doing across the country, Mr. Speaker. He asks about the clinically extremely vulnerable, and that's, of course, an entirely reasonable question. But what we are going to do is make sure that they continue to be protected with priority access to therapeutics and, of course, to vaccines as well. He asks about testing, Mr. Speaker, which is absolutely satirical, because week after week, month after month, I've listened to the Labour Party Mr. Speaker, complaining about NHS testing, denouncing the cost. Did you not hear them, Mr. Speaker? Denouncing the cost of NHS test and trace. And now they want to continue with it when, Mr. Speaker, we do not need to go on with it in the way that we are currently doing. So he asks about our ability to do tests or our domestic ability to manufacture tests. It's as though he doesn't know, Mr. Speaker, that we have in this country now one of the biggest manufacturers of lateral flow tests in Europe. Mr. Speaker, this is a leader of the opposition who, as I say, has shown an absolutely ferocious grip of the wrong end of the stick. He never ceases to amaze. He was wrong on July the 19th. If you remember, totally wrong. He said we shouldn't open up on July the 19th. He said that the Labour Party, there he said that we needed a roadmap back into lockdown, Mr. Speaker, during December. They wanted to stay. He voted several times. They wanted to stay in the European Medicines Agency, and contrary to his denials in this House, Mr. Speaker, he voted several times to do so. He's been consistently wrong on all the big calls. He was wrong then, he's wrong now. What we are doing, Mr. Speaker, is moving forward in a balanced, sensible and proportionate way. Moving forward away from legal compulsion in a way that I think the British people understand, and trusting in them and trusting in their great sense of personal responsibility.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support today's announcement, which is a tribute to British science and to the government's leadership in the vaccine programme. Does the Prime Minister agree, when it comes to future pandemics, that the real danger zone are those early months when we don't have a vaccine against a new virus? And in that context, it's not just whether the NHS can cope, but whether the NHS can cope without switching off other vital life-saving treatments. And if he agrees with that, that it is not just enough to say that we have more doctors and nurses than we had before, but that we also need to make sure we have enough doctors for the future. And if he has plans for that, would he please tell the House how he will make sure that we are actually training enough?
I thank my right honourable friend very much. And he's returning to a theme. He's returning to a theme that he's mentioned several times. We have a vast plan, Mr. Speaker, to recruit more nurses and more doctors than ever before. There already are more in the NHS than at any time in our history. We have 45,000 more now this year healthcare professionals than there were last year, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to fund them.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This statement was billed as a Prime Minister's moment of pride, but it's clear that this morning has been a moment of panic for this government. Disagreement across Whitehall and a lack of any serious engagement with the devolved nations shows that these decisions are bereft of science or consultation. It appears these dangerous choices are purely political and have been made up on the hoof. It is another symptom of a government in turmoil. The illogical reality of UK finance means that these decisions, made for England by a failing Prime Minister, affect the money the devolved nations have to provide testing. It is unacceptable that the ability to protect money, I hear money. We're talking about protecting the people of Scotland, something that this Prime Minister is turning his back on. And it's unacceptable that the ability to protect our population can be imperilled on the basis of a political decision taken by a Prime Minister in crisis. His decisions directly affect whether Scotland has the funding required to keep its people safe. That is the ridiculous reality of devolution, but it's a reality that must be addressed. So will the Prime Minister now confirm what the residual funding for testing will be to enable the Scottish Government to pick up the pieces of this chaotic withdrawal of support? Mr. Speaker, it makes the case for Scotland to take necessary measures to keep our people safe We need the financial ability to make our own choices. That, Mr. Speaker, only comes with independence. Mr. Speaker.
I will also hear the Leader of the Opposition in silence. I don't need the Burger King. He certainly doesn't need it. I don't need it in Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. PCR testing, the legal requirement to self-isolate and access to lateral flow testing have been instrumental, Prime Minister, in containing the virus. As we move forward to live with COVID, these are the very safeguards which support a return to normal life. And these short-sighted decisions have long-term implications. They also hamper vital surveillance efforts and impede the ability to respond to new variants. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we have a Prime Minister beset by chaos and mired in a police investigation for breaking his own COVID laws, and he can shake his head, but that's the reality, Mr. Speaker. A Prime Minister who has no moral authority to lead, desperately seeking to appease his backbenchers. We know this reckless statement flies in the face of advice from scientists at the World Health Organization. That's because this statement is not about protecting the public. It's about the Prime Minister scrambling to save his own skin.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you wouldn't believe it from what the right honourable gentleman has just said, but the cooperation between the UK government and the Scottish Authority has been outstanding and will continue to be outstanding. And I can tell him. He asked about free tests and how they're to be paid for. It's very important. The free tests will, of course, continue until the beginning of April. And of course, if people want to continue beyond then, and I've set out for the House the reasons why we think it's much more sensible to focus, Mr. Speaker, on surveillance and spotting new variants, put our investment into that rather than mass testing. Then he has, Mr. Speaker, access to the 41 billion record settlement that he has under Barnett, and he also, Mr. Speaker, has access to hundreds of millions from the health and care levy. The only astonishing thing is that he voted against it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome the statement the Prime Minister has made. The Prime Minister will also be aware of growing international evidence that lockdowns have been largely ineffective in preventing COVID mortality. And we're acutely aware of the massive damage which has been done economically and to non-COVID health of the people due to lockdowns. Will he review pandemic planning for the future to make sure these crucial lessons are learned?
Yes, I thank my right honourable friend, and he's right to draw attention to all sorts of studies about the efficacy of lockdowns. We'll look at all the evidence. I happen to think that the collective actions of the British public were indispensable in saving many thousands of lives, Mr. Speaker, but I'm sure that all the evidence will be looked at in the course of the inquiry.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. New antiviral drugs have made a huge difference to the treatment of COVID. They are indeed, as the Prime Minister says, the first line of defence, but they work best when given early. Now, one of the requirements at the moment in order to qualify to get an antiviral drug is that the person has tested positive for COVID. If the Prime Minister is going to get rid of free lateral flow tests, how are people going to get access to those medicines?
Mr. Speaker, obviously, great respect to the right honourable people who are symptomatic will, of course, continue to have access to testing.
It's a birthday person, Sarah Bretliff.
Programme is the reason that we're in this position today, and I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody involved in Highburn and Haslingden for the rollout of the vaccination programme and those who have had to deal with the restrictions for longer than most. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that this is exactly why we must learn to live with the virus due to how damaging restrictions can be on mental health and well-being?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And we have to set all these decisions, the cost of lockdowns, the cost of on people's mental health and well-being, against the difficult decisions that we have to make about opening up our society. And I think the House understands that. I think this is a balanced decision that is entirely right. And I should just clarify to the right honourable gentleman that, of course, those who are vulnerable, who are symptomatic, will, of course, continue to have access to testing. And I should have said that in my answer to his question.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a recent survey, the majority of NHS leaders agreed it was not the right time to end free testing for the public. Can the Prime Minister tell me why he disagrees with those NHS leaders and what scientific advice he has considered to come to this decision, which could have a real impact on the NHS elective recovery plan?
I hear the anxieties of people, but I have to say that I think that this is the balanced and the right decision. Testing, and I just remind her of what her benches have previously said about the cost of testing. We now think that the best thing to focus on is, given the severity of Omicron, the best thing is to focus on surveillance and to use the huge funds that we're currently dedicating to mass testing on electives and all the other things that we need to do.
Clark.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker. Sir Andrew Pollard of the Oxford Vaccine Group said this morning that it doesn't make a big difference whether the decision to lift these restrictions is taken now or in a few weeks' time. So it's not clear what the purpose of waiting any longer would be. But one of the things that we do know in the past is at times we didn't have the testing capacity that we needed at times when we needed it most acutely. So given the ongoing surveillance, if that were to throw up a variant that was more dangerous than Omicron, how quickly can we stand up and deploy again mass testing?
I thank him, and that's exactly the right question, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're putting so much emphasis on surveillance, on the ONS, with its amazing granular ability to detect what is going on in local areas, as well as other forms of surveillance. We want to spot the new variant of concern as soon as we can, Mr. Speaker, and then we want to surge our testing capacity in the way that we did before, and of course much faster now, since it is all ready to go. We will have stockpiles, Mr. Speaker. We will keep our labs in readiness, and we will be able to surge where necessary. But now is not the right time to continue with mass testing. Or from April, it will not be the right time to continue with mass testing in the way that we have.
David.
Can I join the Prime Minister in sending our very best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen and hope she gets well soon? Mr. Speaker, there are millions of family carers across our country taking regular lateral flow tests to ensure they don't pass COVID onto their vulnerable loved ones. The Prime Minister now says these family carers must pay for COVID tests out of their own pocket, even though so many family carers can hardly make ends meet at the moment. Is the Prime Minister really telling people they must choose between money for the weekly shop or a test so they don't accidentally take this contagious virus into their loved ones' homes? Surely such a tax on caring would be unfair and unjust.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to draw attention to the need to honourable gentleman's right to draw attention to the need to protect care homes and those who work in care homes. He should wait until March, when we'll be setting out in more detail those who will continue to be entitled to free tests.
The man for the rules, Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, almost 2 years ago now, this House voted unanimously on the statutory measures necessary to keep people safe during the pandemic. And I agree with the Prime Minister that now, thanks to the vaccines, these measures are no longer necessary, and indeed that we're the first major country in the world to be past the pandemic. Yeah. But isn't it extraordinary that despite that consensus on restrictions back then, the consensus on giving people back their freedom, which is often so much harder, and trusting to personal responsibility, that consensus appears only to exist on this side of the House?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's a great shame that the opposition cannot find it in themselves to support what I think is a balanced and proportionate approach, and one, Mr. Speaker, that recognises that COVID has not gone away and that we cannot throw caution to the winds.
Rod Shaw.
Mr. Speaker, given everything else the Prime Minister said this afternoon, why is he keeping the bureaucratic and irritating passenger locator form?
Right. Well, a welcome call for liberty from the opposition benches, but I can tell him that we already have one of the most open travel systems in the world, and the passenger locator form, I understand his grievance against it. We are certainly reviewing it by Easter.
Sir John Redwood.
Great news that our freedoms are being restored. So can the Prime Minister now bring that same focus and government innovation shown on this topic to vanquish the cost of living crisis so that more people have enough money to enjoy the freedoms?
Yes. You bet, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do not know how well the vaccine works on immunocompromised people, and they and their loved ones will rightly be extremely worried. And as the Honourable Member for Leeds Central raised, there are delays in getting test results, thus delaying access to life-saving antivirals. Can we allow them to have a supply of antivirals at home? Because if his pharmaceutical interventions would save lives, let's make sure that they can access them ASAP.
Mr. Speaker, we've already secured more antivirals and therapeutics per head than any other country in Europe. What we need to do is ensure that those who are clinically extremely vulnerable do have access to them, and 1.3 million of them have already been sent tests.
Colin Mumby-Croft.
Mr. Speaker, whilst the threat from COVID has changed, thanks in no small part to the outstanding vaccination efforts led by my honourable friend, the Prime Minister, he will know that the effects on local hospitals will last for years to come. Does he agree with me that now is the right time to invest in upgrades to hospitals like Scunthorpe?
Now is exactly the right time, Mr. Speaker, to invest in hospitals like Scunthorpe across the country. I cannot give a commitment to the particular project that she described, but it is the kind of project, Mr. Speaker, 48 of which, as you know, Mr. Speaker, we are progressing across the country.
First of all, can I welcome the fact that we are having these restrictions lifted, and I hope that the Prime Minister will engage with the Health Minister in Northern Ireland to make sure that the same measures are exercised in Northern Ireland. The Prime Minister said, though, that it is important that we get our confidence back. We have lived through 2 years of fear being instilled in the population. Can he tell us what nudge tactics he now intends to engage in to ensure that that confidence is restored so that people can get back to work, back into the shops and restaurants, and back doing the things which make life enjoyable?
Parties. Perhaps I could begin, Mr. Speaker, by echoing the condolences for the DUP MLA, Christopher Stalford. And Mr. Speaker, I agree wholly with his sentiments. We do need people to get their confidence back, and as I said the other day, what I think people can do, they can set an example. They can go to work, Mr. Speaker. I think going to work is well. You wait and see. Going to work, Mr. Speaker.
David Davis.
Cheer up the Prime Minister by welcoming what he has to say today. And say to him that the comment of the Leader of the Opposition that the government had no plan to deal with this was destroyed by his own right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, who pointed out that antiviral therapeutics were incredibly effective, 95% effective against this disease. And am I right, can the Prime Minister confirm that we have 2.75 million courses of such therapeutics available to us already?
No, Mr. Speaker, I can't confirm that. What I can tell him, in fact, we have twice the amount. We have million doses.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Living with COVID does not mean ignoring it, and he will be aware that lifting of restrictions today flies in the face of advice from many NHS leaders and health experts, including the BMA and the World Health Organization. And saying everyone should take personal responsibility, while at the very same time taking away the very means that would allow them to take that personal responsibility, is utterly perverse. So what would he say to those of my constituents, particularly those who are clinically extremely vulnerable, for whom his Freedom Day is a day of profound fear and loss of freedom? And would he clarify his response to the Right Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton? Because it's not just an issue of free testing for people in care homes, it's a question of free testing at the very least for the almost 7 million carers up and down this country.
So just on that, Mr. Speaker, she should wait, as I said to her right honourable friend from Kingston and Surbiton. And on the clinically extremely vulnerable, I think it's very important to remember that they do have, and we will continue as we have throughout the pandemic, to look after them with all the therapeutics that we can, with vaccines where that's appropriate. As you know, the House knows the shielding programme ended in September. But I think what people need to recognise with the CEV, with the clinically extremely vulnerable, is that we should treat them with caution, just as anybody with any respiratory disease should treat the clinically extremely vulnerable with caution, respect them and act with responsibility.
Edward Timpson.
Mr. Speaker, and I fully endorse the Prime Minister's statement. It's a significant step forward. But whilst also wanting to get more confidence back into the country, people also want some consistency so they can plan ahead. And to that end, will he look at what we do with schools and education more generally, particularly around making them an essential part of our national infrastructure, so that in any future occasions where we may be considering restrictions across the country, schools, nurseries, colleges and universities are at the very back of that queue, so that we make sure that that lost learning we saw during this pandemic doesn't happen again?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and that's why we're ensuring that schools are able to be as COVID secure as possible, sending out 350,000 CO2 monitors, 9,000 air cleaning units, amongst other steps that we're taking to protect schools. And I think it's very, very important that we should get the message over to everybody that schools are safe, and not one of the many things, Mr. Speaker, that the Leader of the Opposition got wrong.
Alex Davis-Jones.
The Prime Minister, in outlining his reckless plan for living with COVID, announced that he is relying on the British public to apply personal responsibility when it comes to the virus. Does this also apply to the Prime Minister?
She says it's a reckless plan, Mr. Speaker. That was exactly the word that the Right Honourable Gentleman Leader of the Opposition used to describe the July 19th openings. I wonder whether she still believes that.
Mr. Speaker, I'll take the Prime Minister's statement, if I may, as his application to join the COVID recovery group. He's very welcome indeed. I only wish it had been sooner. Can I ask him a question, though? On all of the lockdowns and the serious restrictions have all been implemented using the Public Health Act, some of them by ministerial decree, only approved by Parliament retrospectively. If we're to believe that next time will be different, why doesn't this plan include proposals to change the Public Health Act to make ministers more accountable to Parliament now, rather than kicking it into the long grass, waiting for the results of the COVID public inquiry?
Well, I know that my right honourable friend is a staunch Thatcherite, and he will recall it was Margaret Thatcher who actually promulgated the Public Health Act in 1984. It has served this country well for a long time. I'll consider the point that he makes. It is a valuable one, but I think it may also be something that the inquiry will want to consider themselves.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With 38,000 new COVID cases today, can the Prime Minister explain which public health experts advised abandoning testing and isolation, and when will that advice be published?
Yes, I thank her very much. And as you know, cases are falling, hospitalisations hospitalisations are falling, and the number of excess deaths from Omicron is actually in negative territory, and we consult a wide range of scientific opinion, including SAGE and clearly CSA and CMO, but the decisions are for ministers, and we take them.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now then, unlike the opposition, the Prime Minister has got all the big decisions right through the pandemic. But will he agree with me that we should never return to a full lockdown, and any isolation should be targeted? It should be the clinically vulnerable, the elderly and the Labour front bench.
Not in that order.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has put it brilliantly and succinctly, and I have nothing to add.
Chris Bryan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Liberty is always better than the alternative. As long as everybody can share in that liberty equally. So the anxiety for some of us, especially those who represent very poor communities, is that if you are symptomatic and free testing is ended, you may end up having to pay £59, £119 for a PCR test. And then on top of that, if you do the responsible thing and stay away from work, you may be in a job where you're not going to get any money at all, or you're going to get pathetic sick pay. Don't we have to make sure, if we are going to make sure that everybody shares in that liberty equally, that the poorest in Britain get a better deal?
The right honourable gentleman makes a very important point, but I think that overwhelmingly, first of all, there will be statutory sick pay available, but secondly, I think if I may say so, I think he underestimates people's sense of responsibility, and also people's willingness to do the right thing by others.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome what the Prime Minister has set out today, and I especially welcome his commitment to Scunny Hospital. And I also welcome his continuation of the ONS survey study, not least because my mum and dad have been taking part in it, and it's given them something to do throughout the course of COVID, rather than text me constantly. But can I, on NHS testing, as somebody who knows works in the NHS myself, I like getting my test before I book on duty. It makes me feel safe when I'm going into care homes to attend patients or elsewhere. So as he sets out how testing will continue in March, can he set out clearly what the situation will be for testing of NHS workers?
Can I first of all thank my honourable friend very much for his service in the NHS and throughout the pandemic, and I've seen him in action, but also to say that on his point about the NHS, that will be for the NHS to determine themselves.
Florence Session-Lurby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister mentioned this afternoon it's about personal responsibility, and it is. It's about our personal responsibility not to inadvertently pass on that virus to someone who's vulnerable. It's about our personal responsibility to do the right thing if we have the symptoms and if we have COVID. It's about our personal responsibility to think about our neighbours, our friends, our carers, the people who need those restrictions lifted. What does the Prime Minister have to say to my vulnerable constituents in Vauxhall who are concerned that this personal responsibility that the Prime Minister wants us to take may inadvertently lead to them catching COVID?
Prime Minister.
I thank her very much, and she's right to focus on personal responsibility, but the other part of the strategy is the vaccinations, and this is a vaccine-led strategy. And that's what enables us, and that's what enables us now to rely on people's personal responsibility as well.
Lee Manchester.
Mr. Speaker, can I very much welcome the statement by the Prime Minister and the way he set out the argument with regards to living with COVID in respecting restoring people's freedoms and at the same time with regards to protecting public health. The key advance that we have for future, Prime Minister, is that we have the mapping exercise with vaccination centres already in place, such as in Medway. With that being the case, will the Prime Minister also thank the excellent volunteers and the NHS staff in Medway and look at their bid for a new Medway hospital in my constituency for the future?
No, Mr. Speaker, I better be careful what I say about more hospitals. We want to build as many hospitals as we possibly can, but we'll have to look at his plan. I do want to thank the Medway volunteers. I want to thank everybody still involved in the vaccination campaign. There are still millions of people, Mr. Speaker, who have not yet had their booster, and I urge them to get it.
Catherine West.
Lovely to have the Prime Minister with us today, not filling in his questionnaires or having his busy meetings with the police. Speaker, can he confirm or deny the reports that there is a sell-off plan to the Vaccine Manufacturing and Innovation Centre, which has been founded on the values and the mission of people like Dr. Sarah Gilbert, who invented the AstraZeneca vaccination? There are rumours going about that this public-private enterprise will be sold off to the private sector. Will he confirm or deny what is the government's intention? Because the essence of the reason that we were ahead with the vaccine was the excellence and the values of those wonderful British scientists who worked their socks off to get this. Don't just sell it off.
Mr. Speaker, I might also add that one of the most important factors in the success of the vaccine rollout was the private sector, and it was private sector investment, Mr. Speaker, that led to the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Pfizer vaccines, and we will make sure that we work with the private sector to continue to develop this country's native indigenous ability to manufacture mRNA and other types of vaccines.
On Bailey.
Speaker, keeping healthy people at home in isolation has had a devastating impact on lives, businesses and important life events like weddings. So I welcome these changes to trust the British people and to allow people to plan with confidence. Yet we all have constituents who are immune compromised and they're vulnerable, like the woman who wrote to me this morning. Unlike what the opposition budgets say, they do not have a monopoly on compassion. We care about these people. Will my right honourable friend just reassure again that these people will get the support they need and that the timing is right and there's no point in waiting for these changes?
Yes, she's absolutely right, Mr. Speaker, and we'll make sure that those people get not just the antivirals that they need, but also the tests that they need.
Karen Smith.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I think that's the point I would really like clarification from the Prime Minister, because I think we've learnt today that the 7 million carers won't get tests, NHS staff and care staff would have to be found within existing budgets, thus making those waiting lists even more precarious. But eligibility for antivirals is based on being over 12, being at high risk, having symptoms or testing positive for COVID-19, for which people will have to pay. Can the Prime Minister confirm that that is the case? And I see the Health Secretary is helping him out, but if you could clarify that for people, that would be really helpful.
Mr. Speaker, she will. If she waits a little bit longer, she will get. She will get a breakdown of how we propose to support the most vulnerable. But we will support them, Mr. Speaker, as we have done throughout the pandemic.
Rebecca Lee.
Experts will argue for years whether we made the right choices, and some of us, for what it's worth, would have liked a lighter touch. But one thing is certain, and we know this from independent testimony which has emerged from a former advisor of the Prime Minister, that but for his freedom-loving instincts and libertarian instincts, these lockdowns would have been much longer and much worse, with incalculable consequences for the young and people's mental health. So can we rely on the Prime Minister in the future to rule out any more lockdowns in the coming decade while he remains Prime Minister?
What you can certainly rely on, Mr. Speaker, is that this government will take the tough decisions to protect the British people, and we will have a vaccine and science-led approach to dealing with this pandemic.
Simon Mulholter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has come to the House today unable to state whether carers in our communities, visiting home after home in one day, often of older people and those who are clinically extremely vulnerable, will still have access to free tests in order to keep themselves and their patients and clients safe. He has now said that testing for NHS staff will be a matter for the NHS. Surely he can do better than this. Even the NHS and carers need to be able to plan ahead for what is coming. Won't he come clean with the House today about his intentions?
Mr. Speaker, what we're doing is moving away from systematic mass testing of large numbers of people, which is no longer the right way to deal with Omicron, to a surveillance-led approach. And of course, we will continue to look after the most vulnerable and those who need it, Mr. Speaker.
Peg Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the path to freedom the Prime Minister has set out? And I am sure that as the Leader of the Opposition, the Welsh First Minister will condemn the plan today, but in about 2 weeks present the same plan as his own. So could I ask my Prime Minister to reach out to the Labour First Minister and the other devolved administrations who we have worked well with when ugly nationalism is put aside, to get those freedoms for the residents of Montgomeryshire as quickly as possible.
I thank my honourable friend, and I indeed, as I extend the hand of cooperation to our Scottish friends of the Scottish administration, I hope that the Welsh administration in Cardiff will see the way forward. And as I've said many times before, the similarities in our approach greatly outweigh the differences.
Clive Afford.
It's hard to imagine that this is the Prime Minister that missed five COBRA meetings at the start of this pandemic. My constituent, who spoke to me yesterday, who's immunosuppressed, anticipated the difficulties that the Prime Minister is having over testing for people who are clinically vulnerable. She wanted to know whether she was going to have ready access to free tests and whether she was going to get ready access to antivirals should she test positive. Exactly. And what is the situation that those people are being plunged in today?
I thank you very much. The answer to those questions is yes and yes. So for the 1.3 CEV, 1.3 million clinically extremely vulnerable, they will of course be given access to testing, free testing, Mr. Speaker, and they will also have access to the largest quantity of antivirals and therapeutics per head of any European population.
Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With a world-leading successful vaccination programme, with the fastest growth rate in the G7, and in my South Leicestershire constituency, some of the highest employment that we've seen in generations, does this not demonstrate that during this COVID pandemic, when it comes to the big decisions, this Prime Minister and the government he leads has got them right?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, look, I'm casting modesty, if not caution, to the winds. Yes, we have got it right, Mr. Speaker, though there have been some very difficult decisions, and would have been nice today, finally, to have had the support of the opposition.
Rupert Hawke.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. I'm sure the whole House will join me in paying tribute to my constituent Jamal Edwards, a musical pioneer taken from us way too young yesterday. The Prime Minister justifies this crowd pleaser for his own MPs with warning us about damage to the economy. But can I ask him, when the ONS say that 1.3 million of our fellow citizens are suffering from the debilitating condition of long COVID, which actually has rendered 396,000 people economically inactive. It causes dysfunctionality, it ages people by 10 years. What is it that this Prime Minister is doing to advance research and treatment into this condition? And how does today's exercise help those people?
She's absolutely right, Madam Deputy Speaker, to mention the problem of long COVID. We've invested £224 million into expanding NHS treatment of long COVID, and we're putting another £50 million into research into that syndrome.
Henry Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome the Prime Minister's statement today, a return to liberty, so that we can further grow our economy, so that we can tackle those other health conditions. But can he say a little bit more about what targeted support will be provided for those who are immunosuppressed and immunocompromised, such as those with blood cancer? And then monoclonal antibodies.
I thank him very much. So we've secured supplies of monoclonal antibodies, as I told the House, in record numbers. But what we'll also do is make sure that those who are immunosuppressed have access to testing to see whether they need the therapeutics.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The deep irony about this Prime Minister election as in personal responsibility won't be lost on the public watching at home. And to misquote Kevin Bridges, personal responsibility won't pay the bills. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, he called for a full nations approach, time and time again, bemoaning any deviation in approach in Cardiff, Belfast or Edinburgh. Now he is recklessly, dangerously dropping all restrictions in England ending community testing without consultation or consideration of devolved needs and flying in the face of the scientific advice he has been given. This just proves that his full nations approach is simply meant to follow Westminster's direction, no matter how rash, doesn't it?
First of all, Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, we're not dropping the testing until the beginning of April, as he knows, and it's only thanks it's only thanks to the massive financial firepower of the UK that we've been able to run the biggest testing. We've been able to run the biggest testing operation in Europe, plus the fastest vaccination rollout.
Michael Fabricant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I ask my right honourable friend to cast his mind back to January last year, when Chris Whitty said there will come a time when COVID will be the same as flu, where actually there are 7,000 to 20,000 deaths each year. At that time, there was no comment against him from either the Labour Party or the SNP. Now that we have excess deaths at -9% of what is normal at this time, is he as baffled as I am about the attitude that the Labour front bench now has?
Yes, actually, Mr. Speaker, I am. I thank you very much. I'm genuinely surprised by the approach that they've taken today. I do think it is wrong, but I think you're making an important point about the comparison with flu, because it is very important that people with any respiratory disease think about those who are clinically vulnerable and behave in a responsible and considerate way.
Chiomura.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A plan for living with COVID which does not provide for older and extremely vulnerable people, which does not include school children or sick pay for the working people or testing. Isn't it the case that this is a plan in the same sense, only in the same sense, that his birthday was not a party?
No, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a plan that addresses every single one of those priorities. Every single one of those priorities: sick pay, schools, the vulnerable. This plan deals with all of them, and I think it's the right way forward. And I think actually she should support it.
David Evans.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I strongly welcome and endorse my right honourable friend's statement today, restoring our freedoms. Would he agree that the restrictions, although necessary, have taken a very heavy toll on businesses and our society, and we have to live with the virus for the future? However, on this side, we passionately believe in trusting the people to take personal responsibility.
Beautifully put, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Patrick Grady.
Madam Deputy Speaker, are the 100 million doses of vaccine being donated as part of the global response counted towards or in addition to the government's 0.5% ODA target? And when will it stop blocking agreement on a TRIPS waiver so that developing countries can take vaccine response into their own hands?
Hear, hear.
He's raising a very important but very difficult issue. And I spoke in answer to the honourable lady opposite. I mentioned the importance of the private sector. We do need to ensure that the pharmaceutical companies have the wherewithal to make these colossal investments that offer hope for humanity.
Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to start by congratulating my right honourable friend for his forbearance, because across that dispatch box, first he was faced by the vacillations of general indecision, and then by the rank opportunism of Captain Hindsight. So does my right honourable friend agree with me, if he'd listened to Lieutenant Lockdown there, instead of having the first major economy to unlock and a world-leading vaccine programme, we'd now be facing a major catastrophe?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and the most important thing, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we would not, if we'd taken those steps, if we'd remained in lockdown, we would not have the financial wherewithal, the firepower, the money to pay for all the things that the people now need support with, not least, Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, clearing the COVID backlogs.
Brian Davis.
Thank you. The Prime Minister says that this is a scientific decision.
So can you remind the House what the current R rate is, the reinfection rate, what it's projected to be by the start of May, and at what level of R rate is he willing to reintroduce testing and self-isolation? Or isn't it a scientific decision?
As I've said earlier on, Madam Deputy Speaker, the rate of infections is falling, and so are hospitalisations.
Teresa Villiers.
Aspects of the pandemic has been that many people have been unable to visit their sick or even dying relatives in hospital. And visiting has still been very difficult, even with the improvement in the COVID situation. Well, will the Prime Minister make sure this day is when NHS visiting requirements in our hospital go back to normal? Because that is the humane and compassionate thing to do.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my right friend very much. I know she speaks for millions of people around the country. I can tell her that many restrictions have already been lifted, and they will continue to be lifted.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 3 years ago, the government consulted on much-needed reforms to statutory sick pay, rightly recognising that the current system is inflexible and doesn't reflect modern working life. Those reforms were postponed when the pandemic hit, and instead day one access to statutory sick pay was introduced. I think he's just announced that day one access to statutory sick pay is going to be withdrawn in a month's time. Will he then now bring forward the much needed and long delayed reforms to statutory sick pay?
As the right honourable gentleman knows, that statutory sick pay is only a part of what many employees already receive as part of their sick pay.
Duncan Baker.
To remind people, the Prime Minister was right last July when we came out of lockdown with the sensible steps that we took. Also proved right that we were absolutely doing the right thing when we went against the grain of many other nations and ended up riding out the situation that we had at Christmas. So I entirely endorse what we're seeing today. There's been a number of good questions about the immunosuppressed. So could I ask a slightly different one, that rather than wait for assessments from a GP or a consultant, who are, after all, very busy and not working 24/7 all the time, that we consider a 24-hour immunosuppressed hotline for advice which would help these anxious people and give direct support as they learn to live with COVID.
Can I thank my honourable friend for that extremely interesting idea, and I know it's one that my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, may wish to discuss with him.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm not sure if the Prime Minister understands that supporting people to self-isolate isn't a restriction on their freedom. It's actually what a responsible government does. So he will know that millions of people don't qualify for SSP at the moment, and without financial support they will not be able to self-isolate. So can he understand the invidious position that he's actually putting some people in?
Madam Deputy Speaker, of course I understand the difficult position that some people may find themselves in, but I hope that everybody will also understand that it is our job to be responsible towards others and to avoid spreading the disease.
James Stevenson.
Speaker, one of the biggest tragedies of the pandemic has been the isolation and desperation of those living in care homes and of their families at home, many of whom joined groups like Rights for Residents. Can the Prime Minister assure them that they will now be able to visit their loved ones in care homes with the use of testing and other measures to keep them safe?
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When people attend our wonderful Lewisham Hospital A&E department for treatment and have a blood test, they are automatically tested for HIV unless they opt out. The oldest person to discover she was HIV was 75 years old. The reason I raise this to the Prime Minister is because many people still have weakened immunity and do not know this. Having COVID restrictions lifted further exposes people with a weakened immunity to the virus. Can the Prime Minister say how he intends to protect these people?
I thank her very much, and she's right to draw attention to the immunosuppressed and those who are particularly vulnerable. That's why they will continue to have access to free testing, plus the therapeutics that I've described.
Craig Whittaker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The British sequencing regime in this country is one of the best in the world, with over 13% of all tests sequenced here in this country. Now, on that basis, can my honourable friend say what steps are being taken to ensure that despite reductions in testing, that our sequencing capacity in this country will stay at one of the best in the world?
I can certainly assure my honourable friend that we will retain that capacity.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In order to have good surveillance, the Prime Minister will need data. In order to get that data, he will need that data from testing, particularly if it's looking at future variants of the virus. So can he explain where he's going to get that data from in order to trace the future mutations of COVID?
That's exactly what the ONS survey does.
Matt Warman.
Deputy Speaker, it is the vaccination programme led by this Prime Minister that got us to this position, and it is the vaccination programme that will keep us out of lockdown. But what we know as from the pandemic is that online misinformation about the vaccine costs lives. The Prime Minister took a very strong line on this early in the pandemic. As we continue to rely on vaccines, can he reassure me that we will not suffer online misinformation about vaccines, which will continue to save lives?
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, and one of the things the Online Harms Bill does is to try to tackle that kind of pernicious disinformation online.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Unless the Prime Minister publishes the full advice which says that this decision was science-led, it will confirm what we have long suspected, that he is prepared to sacrifice anything and anyone in order to save his own skin. He just claimed that he'd been working closely with the devolved governments on this issue. So why then are the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government saying that the first they'd heard of this plan was his throwaway line at PMQs just 10 days ago?
Here.
Madam Deputy, I would have thought 10 days was quite a lot of notice.
Hugh Merriman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree with the Prime Minister. Now is the right time to make these changes. Can I therefore ask him how it can be justified that the passenger location form stays in place? Can I ask him to commit to end this form by Easter? It would give a much-needed shot in the arm to the travel industry.
I hear him loud and clear, and as I've heard several pleas on that matter today already, and repeat what I've said, we'll be looking into it before Easter.
Flora Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Case numbers of COVID are rising in Wandsworth, and people are really concerned about this plan. They've had to choose between heating and eating, and now they'll have to choose between heating, eating and testing. There have been a flurry of reports about a paralysed cabinet arguing over what to announce here at the 11th hour. The Prime Minister is asking us to have confidence in a plan that health leaders do not have confidence in. Can he assure the House today that the full Cabinet have confidence in this plan?
Yes, of course they do, Madam Deputy. Of course they do, and this plan is completely scientifically attested. It's the right thing to do.
Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for this very important statement today and the reassurance that he has provided in the statement to the clinically extremely vulnerable. The government took huge steps to support those individuals, like creating the shielding programme that delivered millions of food boxes to people's doors within a matter of weeks. And it's absolutely right that we continue to stand by and support them into the future with testing, with the antivirals, as he's already laid out today.
He's quite right in what he says about the plan, but Madam Deputy, can I thank him for his outstanding work when he was responsible for local government in helping to deliver those parcels and helping to support people in the way that he did.
Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister has taken or has consulted the Chief Medical Officer for England and the Chief Scientific Officer for England. But consulting them is not quite the same thing as taking their advice. So can the Prime Minister confirm for the House today, has he taken the advice of the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer when it comes to ending mandatory self-isolation periods and ending testing?
I've not only consulted their opinions, I've taken their advice, and if after this statement, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope very much that he will be able to see a press conference involving both those gentlemen and questions that will no doubt be put to them as well.
Richard Drax.
To lead is a lonely place, and I've seen courage today, and I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for the statement that he's made. If he recalls, we weren't on the same side when it came to lockdown, and in that regard, can I gently suggest to my right honourable friend that were a pandemic to strike again, the government advises and counsels and doesn't curb our freedoms.
It's fair to say that I think everybody is going to want to learn all the lessons from this pandemic, Madam Deputy Speaker, and make sure that we take the best steps should a new variant strike us. But I have great confidence in vaccines.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister has focused now on a vaccines strategy as our first line of defence. So will the Prime Minister assure me that he will take personal responsibility for areas like mine that only have a booster rate of 39% to ensure continued vaccination in our community so that my constituents aren't left behind in this rush to freedom?
Yes, she makes a very good point, and I will do anything I can to help her. The national average for adults for boosters is about 71% now, so that is low, and we will do what we can to help.
Jerome Mayhew.
The data has now proven that Labour and the naysayers were wrong about Omicron. How important was that decision not to lock down at Christmas, building resilience in our communities but also in our economy, in the ability today to lift restrictions?
I thank my honourable. I think that look, we have to be humble in the face of this disease, Madam Deputy Speaker. It remains a dangerous disease. We must continue to be cautious, but we also have to take balanced decisions that are right for the country. And I think it is clear now that both the July the 19th decision and the decision over Christmas and a New Year were correct.
Stephen Flynn.
Madam Deputy Speaker, is it not the case that the decision being taken here today has nothing to do with protecting public health, but everything to do with protecting this Prime Minister from his own backbenchers?
No, he's completely wrong.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The businesses in the market town of Thorn in my constituency are failing to benefit from the UK's fantastic growth due to the main car park being used by a COVID testing facility. With today's announcement, can the PM confirm that these facilities will now be vastly reduced or removed so that towns like Thorn can get back to their bustling pre-pandemic norm?
Yes, I know exactly what he's talking about. I'm sure he speaks for many, and that facility, and it's done fantastic work, but it will be decommissioned shortly.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for the COVID-19 vaccination programmes that all of the citizens of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland have benefited from. Whilst I am in agreement that we broadly need to move safely forward, will the Prime Minister outline whether the plans will include the free lateral flow test for the army of unpaid carers that have kept society taking over, with indications that 1 in 7 are unpaid carers in Northern Ireland alone who need to test before they come in and provide care for their vulnerable or their elderly loved ones, and must therefore have access to free testing to continue to provide this often overlooked but very, very necessary care. Thank you.
Madam, I want to repeat for the House, I think it's incredibly important people understand that the strategy for containing Omicron is not to test everybody or large numbers of people. It is surveillance. That we will be bringing forward particular groups that we want to continue to offer free tests to, such as the clinically extremely vulnerable, but there will be more on that in the course of the next few weeks.
And the prize for patience and perseverance goes to Greg Smith.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's statement this afternoon. He is making the right call. Freedom works. Indeed, we should always cherish freedom. But as we have seen in the past, when previous restrictions have been lifted, some bodies, particularly those with a union hand hovering over them, have continued with those restrictions regardless. So as we rightly lift these restrictions and allow others to lapse, can my right honourable friend give a clear message that the turn to personal responsibility is not a licence for those bodies to carry on with the restrictions regardless?
I thank my honourable friend very much, and but I think that the feeling, if I understand him correctly, he's referring to the devolved administrations. I think that was what he was saying. I think the instinct for liberty burns just as brightly in Scotland and Wales, Mr. Speaker, and Northern Ireland. And I think the people of the whole of the United Kingdom will understand that what we want is a sensible, balanced, and proportionate approach that moves away from legal compulsion, something that has been quite extraordinary for these times, and moves in favour of people being considerate towards others and taking personal responsibility.
Thank you. I will pause for a moment to allow people to leave in a swift and silent manner before making space for the statement from the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. With your permission, I would like to make a statement on the electricity disruptions as a result of Storm Eunice and set out exactly how we're working to ensure that power is restored to people's homes as quickly as possible. Storm Eunice, as everybody knows, brought severe weather, including wind gusts of up to 122 miles per hour, among the highest ever recorded, the highest speeds ever recorded in England. The Met Office took the unprecedented step of issuing a double red weather warning for Friday. Ensuing hurricane-force winds have caused extensive damage to buildings and trees. They've also caused power outages and widespread travel delays. After a day of disruption caused by Storm Eunice on Friday, last night, Storm Franklin made landfall. And it must be remembered that in this difficult time, 4 people have tragically lost their lives in incidents related to storms. And my thoughts, and I'm sure the thoughts of the whole House, with the families and friends of those who have lost loved ones. The Met Office estimates that further strong gusts today, though not on the same scale as Storm Eunice, will occur. Some people, particularly in the south and east of England, have been without power for more than 72 hours. I want to reassure them that we have dedicated teams of engineers working night and day to get them reconnected as soon as possible. Continuing poor weather conditions have hampered those efforts, but I'm pleased to say that as of now, over 98% of those affected by storms, over 1.4 million customers, have had their power restored so far, their supply restored. However, as of only 4 o'clock today, there are still just under 30,000 households who are without power. Today, my right honourable friend, the member for Hammersmith and Fulham, has been in Sevenoaks in Kent to see the impacts of the storm and to observe repairs. This weekend, I spoke, Madam Deputy Speaker, directly with leaders at Scottish and Southern Energy Networks, and today I had conversations with leading managers at UK Power Networks and Western Power Distribution. They have given me assurances, Madam Deputy Speaker, that restoration is happening as quickly as possible. The UK has been particularly badly hit by storms this year, but I'm pleased to say that overall our network operators and our brave emergency services have learnt lessons about how we can improve our response, and we will continue to learn those lessons. When I commissioned the review into our response to Storm Arwen in November, I made clear that the very long delays some people faced to be reconnected were not acceptable. I'm pleased to say that where practical, network operators have already implemented improvements to their procedures. Additionally, operators are sharing resources and making sure that engineers are sent to the worst affected areas. Welfare provisions are in place for those who are most in need, particularly the vulnerable members of our community. Network operators are engaged with local partners to ensure that people are being supported. Catering units are travelling to badly hit areas, and smaller welfare units are providing hot water and other facilities to people adversely affected. I'm extremely grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the network operators that in the Storm Arwen situation, we did have issues relating to the difficulty of communicating people's the worst effects of the devastation. And people are still experiencing issues today. But I'm very pleased to say that if they call their network operator by dialing 105 from their mobile, there should be a speedy response. This action will automatically route them to the right operator based on their particular physical location. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the first time in recorded history, I believe, that 3 named storms have come in such quick succession, day after day, since the storm naming convention was introduced little less than a decade ago. It's a difficult time for many people, but I've been reassured that operators are working extremely hard to make sure that people are reconnected as quickly as possible and at the latest in the next couple of days. And I and my department will continue to provide that support and apply pressure where need be to ensure that this happens in a timely way.
Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement, and let me first join him in sending my condolences to the families of the victims who tragically died during Storm Eunice. And I express my sympathy to all of those who have been affected by the storms. Many families have endured real hardship in these last few days without power for an extended period. And I also know, including from my own constituency, that many others are currently facing anxious times from the threat of flooding from Storm Franklin, and my thoughts are with them too. And I also want to join him in offering praise for all the engineers, network staff and the emergency services who have done such a really important job in incredibly difficult circumstances over the last few days, and also local authorities who've played a really important role in the emergency response. On the substance of his statement, let me just make a few points and ask some questions. First, as he says, the most important priority is to reconnect those still without power. I welcome what he says about people being reconnected by Wednesday at the latest, and I trust he will, as he says, hold all the companies to account to mobilise all their resources from indeed around the whole country to make sure this happens. Second, on vulnerable households, as he says in its interim review on the response to Storm Arwen last November, Bayes noted confusion of roles and responsibilities for vulnerable customers and communities that were cut off. He says the arrangements are working better, and I'm glad that lessons have been learned. Can he just tell us how he, as Secretary of State, is monitoring this and is assured of this? Third, on compensation paid by the networks. There were unacceptable delays in compensation payments after Storm Arwen, with 10,000 customers still not compensated 6 weeks after the storm happened. Can he say what he'll be doing on this occasion to ensure speedy payments? And fourth, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to ask the Secretary of State about the longer-term issues these events raise. Now, scientists tell us we can't necessarily attribute the ferocity of Storm Eunice to climate change, but we know we are facing more intense and frequent extreme weather as a result of the climate crisis. So it throws up again the question of our resilience and security as a country. After the storms in 2013, there was a clear sense of the vulnerabilities of the overhead power network and agreement the energy networks would act. In its interim report on Storm Arwen this month, again Ofgem said they would review the costs and benefits of the resilience of overhead lines, and the Climate Change Committee has highlighted climate risks to the power system. Does the Secretary of State agree that events this winter demonstrate the need to give greater priority and indeed probably investment to the resilience of our power network? And more generally on the issue of adaptation, in their 5-year progress report last summer, the Climate Change Committee said the whole issue of adaptation was, and I quote, under-resourced, underfunded and often ignored. Does he agree that these storms and the storms we've seen, does he agree the storms we have seen are yet again a wake-up call about the need for a proper national resilience plan which covers our power lines, flood defences and all of our critical infrastructure? Because the truth is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that as a country we will face significant threats from extreme weather in the years ahead. Today we should acknowledge the important work that has been done to respond to this crisis. But the lesson that has been demonstrated yet again is that we owe people the long-term planning and investment to give them all the protection we can.
I think the right honourable gentleman, as well as I think other members of the House, will be surprised that I'm in a measure of agreement with him. on this. I think he's absolutely right to warn that extreme weather events could, I'm not saying they will, but they could be a feature of our landscape, of our climate. I also remember as a constituency MP the floods of 2013, 2014 and the devastation that they caused. On his specific challenges, he will appreciate the fact that I launched a review into Storm Arwen. We've got an interim report. We've learnt many of the lessons from that interim report. And we're also committed to dealing with other colleagues, conversing with other colleagues across government for a more integrated plan. I'm grateful for him to highlight the extreme weather conditions that many of us may well be facing in the future.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome Secretary of State's statement. Thousands of my constituents across East Sussex remain not just without electricity, but also without water. Now, I recognise this has been one of the worst storms in decades. I also recognise the huge amount of work that the engineers and those from UK Power Networks and South East Water on the ground have delivered to try and fix this. But the situation can't be good enough that our water supply actually requires the electricity system to work, and there's no backup generators in place to pump it into the hills and areas across my constituency. So can I meet with the Secretary of State to discuss how we can get better resilience in place so that the water companies have their own backup generators in place and people are not without water when the electricity goes down?
I think my honourable friend makes a very fair point, and he is absolutely right to point out the difficulties that people are facing, intolerable difficulties with regard to water supply, and that's something which colleagues in the department in DEFRA and also officials in Bays are very, very engaged with, and I'd be very happy to speak to him at a time when it's convenient.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following storms Arwen and Barra in November and December, Malik and Corrie in late January, we've now had 3 named storms in a week in Dudley, Eunice and Franklin, with a potential 4th in 8 days, Gladys, later this week. This winter, it seems, Madam Deputy Speaker, will not go quietly. But naming storms sometimes can dull the impact of these storms, but the truth is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that these storms with the heavy rain and snowfall combined with record-breaking wind have caused huge damage to buildings, environmental destruction, and sadly 4 people have lost their lives as a result of uprooted trees, flying debris and flooding, and my sympathies are very much with all of those affected. Can I join the Shadow Secretary of State in thanking all those engineers restoring power to homes right across the country, and indeed the Network Rail engineers for restoring our track and keeping us moving across the country. And I'm very sympathetic to points he made about compensation payments. But climate change has seen an increased frequency of storms, with Storm Franklin currently causing flood warnings in parts of Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So will the Secretary of State confirm that he will do all he can to ensure his government keeps its climate pledge and the large spending commitments that goes with them, and ignore those on his backbenches who seem obsessed with the UK reneging on its agreements? And what is being done while we're ahead of COP26 to discuss future international responses to worldwide extreme weather? But finally, Eunice left about 1.4 million houses without power. Storm Arwen affected more than 1 million homes, including thousands in Aberdeenshire without power for well over a week. Which short and long-term plans are being considered by the UK Government to strengthen our energy resilience and infrastructure, and crucially, what's being done to ensure we don't see a repeat of last year with thousands without power for so long?
The honourable gentleman raises a number of fair points. I mean, with respect to the net zero challenge, he'll be pleased to know in the latest CSR that was announced by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, at the end of last year, we had a considerable uplift in the capital spend dedicated to net zero. He will also appreciate that for the first time ever, we had a ring fence for tidal stream. So there are lots and lots of things that this government is doing to pursue renewables and to pursue a world in which we have effectively decarbonised our power system. On resilience issues, he will know that I've commissioned the review into Storm Arwen. There's an interim report, and I'm sure he and I will be able to discuss the full report in due course.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, Storm Eunice and Franklin continue to have devastating impacts across Keighley and Ilkley, with several homes still flooded and a landslide being caused to the rear of a property on Westley Avenue in Riddlesden, which has forced several constituents out of their homes, with one property left at structural risk. And my heart goes out to all of those impacted. So can my right honourable friend assure me that emergency support will be made available to all of those affected, but particularly those who face the critical situation of being forced out of their homes for their own safety?
As I suggested in the statement, my honourable friend, I think, will be pleased to know that we are working very, very closely with the distribution network operators to ensure that adequate physical support is given, and also there is a compensation scheme that's been operated with Ofgem, and I personally raised the amount that people could be compensated in the aftermath of Storm Arwen, and we are going to stick to that this time. So there is plenty of support for his constituents.
Wayne David.
Last week saw a red alert for much of South Wales. I note that the Minister has said there's been a number of discussions with electricity companies, including Western Power Distribution. But can he tell the House what discussion has been with the Welsh Government?
We speak to officials in the devolved administrations on a regular basis. I only spoke to WPD and the distribution network companies, but our officials engage with DA colleagues all the time.
Theo Clark.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following this week's storms, yet again my Stafford constituents have been hit by flooding in their homes, and Staffordshire businesses have again been disrupted. So will my right honourable friend work with me to create a flood control centre based in Stafford, which will provide 24-hour local assistance to my constituents affected by flooding in Stafford?
So, I'd like to reassure my honourable friend that as a consequence of the 2013-2014 floods, we did establish and make much more robust local resilience fora and flood defence networks. And I'd be very happy to discuss with her schemes that may be applied to her constituency, particularly in regard to a centre in Stafford.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are flood warnings in place across South Yorkshire, a worrying time for many in Barnsley, especially those without adequate insurance. Now, I acknowledge the work of Flood Re, but sadly for many it is still not affordable. So what work is the government doing with insurance companies to make sure everyone can get the insurance that they deserve?
Again, I refer to the 2013-2014 period. I know a number of people weren't in the House at that time, but this is precisely the issue that came up